joining us to celebrate the launch of Marisel Vera's beautiful, heart-wrenching, and triumphant work of historic fiction, The Taste of Sugar. Hello, I'm Stephanie Flom, Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. Welcome. Marisel's launch is part of our Made Local series, presented in partnership with the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Thank you to the library, as well as our wonderful independent bookstore partner, White Whale Bookshop, who has copies of Marisel's books for sale. We are thrilled that Marisel is joined in conversation with Adriana Ramirez, an accomplished Mexican-Colombian nonfiction writer, storyteller, critic, and performance poet based in Pittsburgh. The early reviews for A Taste of Sugar are glowing. Let me share. Kirkus Reviews writes, Puerto Rico to Hawaii and across decades of love, famine, and war, Vera's breakout novel is a sweeping, emotional tale. Library Journal. Vera's saga is impeccably timed to provide insights into the troubling history of Puerto Rico's relationship with the U.S. and fills a gap in history for many. Booklist. Vera's novel is historic fiction at its best, featuring engaging survivors from a forgotten past. I am personally grateful to Marisel for this gift of this timely book that brings these working class heroes to life against the forces of colonialism, war, racism, and capital, revealing and reclaiming this important and too little known piece of Puerto Rico's history. Please welcome Adriana Ramirez and Marisel Vera.
Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Adriana Ramirez and I have the pleasure today to be talking to Marisel Vera about her amazing book, The Taste of Sugar. Marisel, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here and I'm thrilled to have you talking to me.
Oh, it is such an honor and a pleasure. I thought we would kick things off by getting to hear a little bit about the book. It's about a family and the journey that they go through from late 19th century in Puerto Rico under Spanish rule and eventually to working in the early 20th century on plantations in Hawaii. And I thought you could speak to a little bit about the relationship between, the Vega family and the larger story about the island of Puerto Rico.
Well, The Taste of Sugar is about a coffee family in Utuado, in Puerto Rico. This family lives under Spanish colonialism, as Puerto Rico did for 400 years. And then the Americans come in and the US invades the island during the Spanish-American War, and there's a military occupation of Puerto Rico. And that is still going on today, not the military occupation, but Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States over 100 years later. And this novel is about this Puerto Rican family living under colonialism, Spanish and American, and how it survives. I saw this book not only as the story of this family, but the story of Puerto Rico as a colony. And it was important to me to write about the Spanish colonialism because I know even Puerto Ricans who aren't really clear about that. And I wanted to, in a way, claim the history of Puerto Rico, the Spanish colonialism and also the American. And I wanted to do that not just for my readers, but for myself, because when I was growing up, I didn't know anything about Puerto Rico except what I learned, the little bit I learned from my parents and the nothing that I learned in the Chicago public schools. The Chicago public schools and the history books told me that Puerto Rico was a commonwealth of the United States, belonging to the United States, or no, maybe a part of the United States. Now we know that's not true. It belongs to the United States. It's not a part of the United States. And for my mother,
I'm sorry. And you went to a high school that was mostly full of Puerto Ricanos, right? Wasn't it Roberto Clemente High School?
Roberto Clemente High School, yes, in Chicago. And for my mother, I learned that Puerto Rico es un estado libre asociado. And she was proud of that, proud of being Puerto Rican and American. But what did that mean? My mother couldn't answer those questions because she didn't know. She was an excellent student in Puerto Rico, graduated from high school, but all her books were in English. The history she was taught was American history in English. Her teachers were Puerto Rican and their language was Spanish, and they could barely read English if they could read English. And here they have to teach from these English language books. So this book is it's my, in a way, a gift.
It's almost a
sorry?
Oh, it's almost a reclamation of sorts.
Yes, I see this as I am claiming my history. I am claiming my heritage, and I am doing it for myself. I did it for myself, and I did it for my children so that they could know their own history. And I did it for my mother, because my mother didn't know her own history. And when I was writing this novel, whenever I learned something fascinating or interesting, for me, practically everything was fascinating, I would call her and I would say, "Mommy, did you know?" And she was so excited to learn and so interested. And I'm sorry she's not here still with me so I could share this novel with her, but it was still it was still important to do, I think.
Well, and I love that it's also a love story. You know, it's easy for a book like this to become kind of like dry, boring history or something. But at the end of the day, it's not. It's about, you know, Valentina and Vicente and this couple who are trying to kind of also keep their marriage and their family intact throughout, you know, the currents of history, if you will. Can you speak a little bit about that? Yeah.
I love stories. I think it's important to write a love story, especially for people who are browbeaten by circumstances, by the economy, by new laws that take away your land and take away your livelihood. I think it's important to show Puerto Ricans as the warm and wonderful people that we are. Not everybody, of course, but in general.
Yeah, and I think the love story comes through so well. And I was wondering if there was a part of it that you'd like to read for us so we can get a little sense of the world that you've built for us so well.
I would love to. I think I would like to read the first couple pages of when we meet Valentina and the first couple pages of when we meet Vicente, because although I would say I wanted it to be both persons' story, but sometimes it doesn't work out like that. So maybe it's a little bit more Valentina's story, but I think it couldn't be this novel if we didn't have Vicente. So I wanted to share both with you.
Yeah, no, and I think it very much, you know, to answer your question, he's such a huge part of like every decision that she makes. So I definitely agree. It is about both of them, but please.
Thank you. Chapter 2, French Mademoiselles, circa 1889. Before Valentina Sanchez met Vicente Vega, she was just a girl wishing for romance and adventure, like in the French novels she loved. Her best friend, the wealthy Dalia, was to marry the Spanish caballero she met in Paris on a visit to a new exhibit called the Eiffel Tower. At night, it was lit by gaslight. It reached the clouds, Valentina. Valentina feared that the closest she would ever get to the Eiffel Tower was a drawing Dalia had sketched on the back of a missile. In the tiny bedroom of her parents' small house in Ponce, Valentina woke to the woodpecker's tap on a tree, to the footsteps of the tradespeople walking to La Plaza to sell their wares. The slant morning sun sneaked in through the shuttered windows and caught her in the mosquito netting draped over her bed. Mama told her daughters not to complain because there were no trips abroad or fans of peacock feathers. Valentina and her sister Elena had food to eat, didn't they? They slept in beds with mosquito netting and not in doorways, didn't they? Did they notice a mother and her naked children sleeping on the steps of the Alcaldía? Not even the mayor would help them. He said that he couldn't because tax money went first to Spain, and then there was a town sanitation, and on top of that, he had to pay the salaries of administrators, and then, bueno, always something. Listen to me, muchachas. Count your blessings like raindrops. Valentina's hometown of Ponce was a city of the very rich and the very poor, including many former slaves. Mostly the poor worked for the rich in their grand houses, but there was also a tiny middle class to which Valentina's family belonged, mainly due to the family's connections on her mother's side, something that Mama reminded her husband as often as she deemed necessary. Mama was always economizando. She made do with a single servant, and a woman came just once a week to scrub the floors while she stood over her, supervising. Valentina's mother went daily to the market, cooked most of the meals, and mended the family's clothing with their daughter's help. La lavandera Claudia La Negra came with her children to collect the family's dirty laundry. The littlest child of 4 years carried a bundle of towels on her head with the care of an experienced laundress. Valentina had once heard her mother say that she didn't know how one person could eat, let alone feed her family on the earnings of a laundress. Everywhere they saw the indignities and tragedies that came from lack of money. When the girls accompanied their mother in the cemetery to say prayers at the graves of dead relatives, they often saw silent funeral processions of barefoot men carrying a plain three-sided wood box balanced on long poles like a crude hammock, a black cloth thrown over the cadaver. The grave diggers would flip the coffin over a newly empty grave and dump the pauper's body head first. Beyond the marble mausoleums decorated with exquisite French porcelain roses, Elena led Valentina to an area surrounded by a wall of stone. Valentina, see over there? That's for los pobres. Es la huesera, the boneyard, where the skeletons are tossed to make room for more muertos.
It's funny because in Colombian Spanish, huesera is like laziness. So you're like, oh, me da huesera.
Really?
Yeah.
Which one is laziness?
Huesera, even though it means boneyard. But it really, it's like, oh, que huesera. Like, oh man, I'm so tired. I'm so lazy. Ugh.
Oh, you know what? Oh, you know what? My mother would say, like when she was tired, she would say huesa. And my Puerto Rican friend said she never heard that, so I felt like that was a part of the country that my mother came from, because she would say estoy huesa.
Yeah,
that's kind of like that.
Yeah, in Colombian Spanish, huesera. Anyway, let's go. So you have another passage that you wanted to read for us.
Chapter 3, and this introduces Vicente. Boyhood circa 1800. Sometimes in whispers, Vicente and his brother Luisito called their father, Raúl Vega, el General. His father's temper was infamous throughout the countryside. He often overheard people say that Raúl Vega tenía mal genio o un carácter fuerte. So whenever El General inflicted scorn that scarred their skin like the slash of the whip, his older brother's eyes bored into his. Say nothing. Raúl Vega had taught his sons that the way to know coffee was with your hands and your feet. When Vicente and Luisito were children, their father had set them under a bush to pick coffee berries. Vicente hadn't dared to complain about the mosquitoes and other insects that flew into his eyes and stuffed themselves up his nose. Evil branches scratched his face and tried to thwart his picking. He dreamt of trees. When a tree asked if he were a bird, Vicente observed the ghostliness of the moon, free to come and go as it pleased. Vicente whispered, I am the moon bird. The tree whispered cuentos that the birds had brought back from other lands, tales of riches and pirates and oceans longer than days. A tree complained about the owl that kept it awake each night. When it didn't fly down the mountain, why didn't it fly down the mountain and bother those trees? The coffee trees wished that their taller cousins, the banana and plantain and guava trees, wouldn't hog up all the sunlight, because they too wanted to bask in the sun. There was an eagle that perched on the crown of a tree with such delicacy. The swish of its massive wings as it flew away woke Vicente from his dream. Even Raúl Vega admitted that Vicente had the gift. Vicente's fingers need only touch the coffee berry for it to drop into his palm. He didn't mind that the berries didn't ripen all at once, and that the trees must be picked over and over again throughout the harvest. He told the trees, "Your berries will be washed and dried and roasted to make coffee so delicate, so delicious that it is a drink for the gods. Mere mortals will pay for it in gold and silver. Your berries will become coffee beans that will be transported in ships to faraway places I could never hope to see in this life or the next. Your berries will be transformed into coffee that will be served in the palaces of the most important people in the world, the kings and queens and popes. Your coffee will kiss the lips of the most beautiful señoritas and be served in cafes to idle people who will linger over tiny cups, bewitched. There are people in the world who can never live a day without you." Vicente never shared with others his conversations with coffee trees, but it wasn't because he thought his brother Luisito would laugh at him or that his father might question his sanity. It was because it was between him and the trees. The trees liked the murmur of his voice, his words wrapped around their leaves, as gentle as the nightly fog. When he ate dinner, his thoughts were of the red coffee cherry nestled in the green leaves, not the rice and beans and malanga, and not even when they had pollo fricassé, his favorite. He was back in La Finca, his gaze on the banana and plantain and guava shade trees, blessing the huge green fronds. When he examined the coffee cherries, he held his breath, exhaling only when he saw that they were healthy, that the lack of rain hadn't dried the berries, or that too much rain hadn't stripped the branches bare. When the green trees ripened, they would glisten on his palm like rubies.
I love that section so much. Thank you, Marisel, for sharing it with us. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the influence of magical realism or the marvelous real, you know, especially given that the passages that you just read and the long tradition in Latin American literature of it, you flirt with it a bit. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that.
I have to say that I have read a lot of magical realism in books, but I don't think that I actually studied it. But I have been influenced like a lot of people, and one of my biggest influences is Christina Garcia. Just her writing, I think she's just a fabulous writer. So maybe that's part of it, and I've taken a workshop with her. Basically, I just let my imagination go free. And sometimes when I'm writing, what speaks to me is not necessarily a person.
Huh.
And so that's how I come to magical realism.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is also culturally, right? I mean, we tend to anthropomorphize, language. I know you. But we tend to, you know, bring inanimate objects to life a lot. I think culturally too, you know. I find that my mom will often tell me like, "Oh, the owls know what you're doing," which is not a Twin Peaks reference. But yeah, I think there's something about the connection with nature too. And I love this part particularly because it speaks to, you know, the connection between somebody that works the land and the land itself, right?
Yes, I think Vicente is very connected to the land, and I wanted to honor that as much as I could, the connection to the land in Puerto Rico, the connection to the island, and also especially to farming in the mountains, because my family comes from the mountains, and I still have a lot of family in the mountains of Puerto Rico, and they're farmers. A lot of them, and it's just a connection to the land that even my father still had after many years of not living in Puerto Rico. It was so important to him, and so important to me, important to my claiming my heritage and my history.
Yeah, and I would say that that love is so present in the text, you know, and even when natural disasters come in, you can see how the land hurting really hurts the people that work it and that live off of that. And, you know, even seeing like a tree that doesn't necessarily belong, it breeds a certain amount of bewilderment and all that. And so I really appreciated the way that the geography kind of comes to life on the island.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Certainly. I wondered if you could speak a little bit, when you read the part about Valentina, and you were able to weave in a lot of like the poverty that she encountered in Ponce. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the challenges that you face in talking about class and race and, poverty and stark socioeconomics, especially, Valentina coming from some amount of privilege.
Puerto Rico was a very poor country during the time of my novel, and it has always been a very poor country, and it's basically because of colonialism. In Spanish colonialism, during the 400 years of Spanish colonialism, the money that was collected in taxes, even from poor people, some of my characters make hardly anything, the people that work in the land, yet the Spanish tax them twice a year, every 6 months. They tax them in advance of the salary that they anticipated that they would earn.
And
these are
dancing,
people.
They tax them for things like dancing, right? And like.
Yes, and that was an additional thing. That was like a side thing, but it's like just to live, just to eat. Yeah. These jibaros that I write about on the mountain, they're eating a plátano for the dinner. That's a banana, in case you don't know. A plantain. This is their dinner. And they're taxed on their salary 6 months in advance by the Spanish government. They figure out, okay, you'll probably earn $2 for these 6 months. I'm going to take whatever the percentage was. It was incredible. And when the Americans come in, the Americans don't help, because now the Americans tax you differently. They devalued the silver peso, which was what was used, the currency in Puerto Rico. They devalued it, General Miles, during the beginning of the American occupation, he devalued it to 50% of its worth. So can you imagine?
Well, 50%. And then they used them to make silver dollars, right?
Yes, they bought up people. Well, and only a few months later, President McKinley made it 60%. So he made it slightly better for the silver peso, but everybody had to turn in their silver pesos because it was no longer the currency used on the island. It had to be the American silver dollars. So who buys it up? The banks. Who makes the money? The banks, Americans. And this is a terrible thing for Puerto Rico. So that's one way that that's important. And that's one way that the economy is made worse by colonialism and by American colonialism, the last part about the silver dollars. But it's important. It was important to put this in my novel. It's not nonfiction, but I think that you could tell the story of at least a slice of the story through a novel. And that's what I try to do.
And one of the things that I loved is that different people in the same family can have very different experiences, right? Mm-hmm. Dalia, who you mentioned in the reading, who's sketching out pictures of Paris with Valentina, is somebody who's able to leave and travel and go to Europe. And even Valentina's sister is able to kind of work with the merchant class and is able to work with the Americans for a while and find some prosperity. And so you do a really good job of showing the way that invasion and occupation by different colonial forces affected different Puerto Ricans at different strata differently, and yet they were all very much affected by it. I mean, that's something that I think is very strong in the book, is that you really do get a sense of all of the different ways that people were, again, drastically affected by the larger, waves of like fate and world governments. So I really appreciate that. I was wondering if you could going back to kind of like the romance aspect of it and the love story and the kind of frivolousness, when we talked previously, you'd mentioned thinking about the Grapes of Wrath and even Edith Wharton as influences. And I was wondering if you could unpack that for us a little bit.
Well, with the Grapes of Wrath, I read it years ago, many years ago, but I thought, I guess I must have been very affected by it. And I am, because I grew up in Humboldt Park, which is El Barrio in Chicago, or one of, for me it was El Barrio. I didn't grow up with any advantages economically, and certainly my parents did not, because that's why they came to the United States in Chicago, so that they could work and support themselves. So I think that I have always been very conscious of the haves and the have-nots. And that's kind of like what Puerto Rico society in general, the have and the have-nots. So I think that when I read The Grapes of Wrath so many years ago as a young person, I could really identify with the tragedy of this family who has to move and in search of trying to survive. In The Grapes of Wrath, I remember one scene when they go to one camp and they work. Whatever they're doing for the day's work, they're getting paid with pieces of paper that they use at the company store. And this happened in Puerto Rico all the time. One of my aunts told me about my grandfather, who was Vicente, and how he cut cane at one point in his life, and he got 25 cents. 25 cents. And we're talking in the middle of the century, not during the time that the taste of sugar is set.
Yeah.
So all these kinds of things just really helped shape my worldview, the way I grew up, the way I went to school, how we were treated by non-Puerto Ricans, and also and literature. And the stories from my mother. My parents, my family told a lot of stories, especially my mother. My mother lived on the mountain in Puerto Rico, and she hated living on the mountain. And she loved the city of Ponce. So
is this why Valentina also hates living on the mountain?
Yes.
And likes the city of Ponce?
Yeah, so I thought, okay, she's Ponce, I don't know if you've ever been, it's been devastated recently with the earthquakes. Just this January and February in Puerto Rico, so some of the buildings have been destroyed. But my family loves Ponce because it's very near where they live now in Puerto Rico. And so my mother loved Ponce, and she hated living in the mountains because it was so dark, there was no electricity, nothing to do. And I just couldn't imagine being in that place. So we were talking about Valentina earlier, and her privilege, and she does have a more privileged life, a more cityfied life or town type life, and she has dreams. She's and influenced by literature also, but her literature is like romance novels that she got from her friend Dalia, who gave them to her. So she thinks, oh, one day I'm going to be able to be like these girls, go to Paris. What teenage girl doesn't want this? Well, I'm thinking most teenage girls might. And she, something pretty and at least adventure, travel. And so that's what she wants. And one thing that we have to remember when we're reading Valentina in the beginning is that she's young.
Yeah.
She may be 18, might be at that time, 18-year-olds aren't exactly like 18-year-olds now, but she's young. So she's naive, she could be influenced. And she is influenced by the women in her life, especially when she goes up the mountain. And we were talking about literature. You mentioned literature. I also was influenced by Edith Wharton because I love the women that she writes about, especially Lily Bart. Yeah. I could totally understand Lily Bart. And in a way, Valentina is a little bit like Lily Bart. wanting things, and maybe not choosing the easy road that she could have chosen, both of them, to get those things.
And rejecting a lot of rich suitors.
Because they want, I guess, romance, maybe.
Yeah.
Or love. If not romance, love.
Well, and I think when you're a teenage girl, the two get equated so much. You know, romance and love kind of become the same thing. And I love that in the middle of, you know, hurricanes and civil unrest and all of the things, that she is a girl who cares about romance and love and boys and what they think and what they're doing. And her mother is very concerned about how scandalous she is being. And so
yeah.
I really I really appreciated all of that throughout. What are you hoping, you know, ultimately? I mean, you know, you covered this a little bit, and I know one of the aims is to kind of reclaim and to educate. But what are you hoping that people, you know, get out of reading it as a writer? Do you have any goals, or are you just kind of open to whatever the experience may be?
Well, I hope that first of all, they enjoy reading it, because that's what writers want, right? And I hope that there will be a little bit of enlightenment, maybe, and that my readers who aren't Puerto Rican will get to know Puerto Ricans a little bit better. And my readers who are Puerto Rican will feel celebrated. If I could have those two things, I will feel like I have done my job.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I also wanted to ask you, how do you think the text relates to what's happening in the world today? You know, we're going through a lot. We've been in quarantine, we've got protests happening. Do you think it will resonate with people today?
In my novel, if I think The Taste of Sugar?
Yeah.
Well, I think that it's very clear in The Taste of Sugar, the systematic racism and oppression that Puerto Ricans have to suffer if we're just talking about the American government. And not just in Puerto Rico with the taxation, without representation, that is still the case now. And I would like it very much if readers could connect the dots from the past to the present. How Hurricane San Ciriaco, which I read about in the book, is similar in a lot of ways to Hurricane Maria, and the treatment by the government in both cases is very similar. And during the time of Hurricane San Ciriaco, the American public were the ones who donated money to help the people of Puerto Rico, just like Hurricane Maria. Because the US government didn't have anything like FEMA handy, what they did was McKinley gave permission for the military government to hand out their rations. They organized a board, a charity board, that the fancy women in Puerto Rico were the ones who gave out the money. What's really interesting is during Hurricane San Ciriaco that because of the way the charity was given out, it really helped to restructure or re-entrench feudalism in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of people don't realize is, you know, that feudal systems persisted well into the 20th century, and in some cases are still fairly active in the present day in some very rural areas. So yeah, that's something that is very real. I also thought there was this amazing sense in the book of like how far a human being can be pushed in some ways, and without revealing the ending, you know, there's a moment where the characters are like, we have to do something, you know, we have to rise, we have to fight back, we have to do something. And maybe it was just, you know, because as I was reading, there was the TV was on in the background talking about protests, you know, and I just remember looking up and going, yeah, enough is enough. And just feeling that in my heart, and just knowing that over the course of history, you know, as you cover so well in the novel, that there's still human feeling And there's still, you know, the people that we tend to erase or think of as just peones or laborers or whatever, that they're human beings and they're people, and there's a limit as to how much they can take, you know. And I really thought that resonated with what's happening now.
Well, I think Puerto Ricans have always protested. During this time, right after San Ciriaco, some Puerto Ricans were made to restore a bridge. Well, the Puerto Rican men who were doing this thought the pay that they were getting was very unfair. It was, I don't know, maybe less than $1 or hardly, not enough to meet their needs. And so they went on strike. And General Miles sent down this order that if they go on strike, they're not going to get money. I mean, they're not going to get food for their families. Because that's one thing that they were getting also. They were able to feed their families. A hurricane happened, there is no work. This hurricane took all the plants on the island, ripped off all the trees. Already people were poor. You know, there's the devalued money. If you had money, you can't grow the plants that you were growing are gone. And now you're building this bridge and you think it's unfair. You go on strike, and that's too bad. You don't do the work, you're not going to get fed, and no food for your family. So this is like documented stuff. And so Puerto Ricans have always gone on strike when they needed to. And I guess that's just, maybe that's because Puerto Rico is a colony and has always been a colony. And that's what you do. You have to luchar. When a lot of Puerto Ricans that I know, when I would ask them, ¿Cómo estás? They would say, luchando, siguiendo la lucha. And basically that means, in English, struggling, striving. And I think it has a political connotation also. It means that you're gonna knock me down, but I'm gonna get back up. You're gonna knock me down, but I'm gonna get back up. And I will somehow prevail, at least personally, for myself, for my own self-worth. And I think this is something that I really try to show with Valentina and Vicente, and also with their Vicente's brother Raulito that we meet later in the novel. That, I mean, it gets bad, but they are going to keep luchando.
Well, and you too. I mean, I think it's true in the book. It's true of your characters, but I think it's also true of you as a writer. You know, when we spoke the other day, you were like, well, you know, I feel like I'm old to have my first book. And I was like, no, not at all. And it indicates that you never gave up as well, right?
Well, you know, I guess I learned from my parents not to give up. I remember when I was a teenager that my father worked in a factory and his company went on strike. So my father went on strike. And it was 6 months of my father being on strike. And that was the very first time that, and the only time that I can remember that we had to take food stamps. And which was something that my father never wanted to have to do. But he couldn't go back to work because he was on strike. He had to honor it. And maybe that really taught me that you got to keep getting up, because what is the alternative? I'm not gonna, then they win, whoever they is, society, the bankers, I don't know. The man. Right, so you have to, and I really felt that I had something to say. At least I had something to say for myself, and I think something I wanted to share. So I was just determined to keep at it. I've been very fortunate. I've had 1 or 2 people that have been very supportive of my writing, and that is enough, was enough.
That's awesome. Yay. And to the little girl inside you who used to, you know, read books and think, oh, I don't know that I could ever do this, what would you say?
Well, just to try. And I was saying that because I never saw myself in books when I was growing up, never. There was never a novel of a Puerto Rican girl, somebody that looked like me, somebody who lived in Humboldt Park. Never. Anyone in Clemente High School where I went, I never saw that. I never thought that I could do that. I knew that I could write. And I thought that my voice would be used, I would use it to talk about people and to talk for people who couldn't speak and who couldn't write. And one thing that really influenced me was about the time that I wrote my first short story. I was in 7th grade and it was an assignment English class. During that time in Chicago, there were a series of fires in this neighborhood called Pilsen. It's a mostly Mexican immigrant neighborhood. So what was happening was landlords were paying arsonists to set their buildings on fire so that they could collect the money from the insurance company. Well, the arsonists were setting them on fire with the people in the building, the families in the building. And so the people were dying. And when people died, and when the fire department would come to set out these fires, they would hear people say, fuego, fuego, ayuda, ayuda. But at that time, none of the firemen, they were firemen then, could speak Spanish. So they didn't know what those words meant. They didn't know to go to those voices, or why wouldn't you go to voices? I don't know. But they didn't know what those words meant. And so people died. And in the news media in Chicago, on the television news, in the newspapers, many people blamed the immigrants, the Mexicans, for not learning Spanish. For not learning English, because they only spoke Spanish. People wrote in editorials and said things like, oh, you're in this country, you should learn English, it was their fault. And I'm here 13 years old and 13, 14 years old, something like that. And I'm reading this stuff and I'm like, they're just people. Why can't we see them as people? Who cares what language they speak? And I just had this feeling that one day I was going to write stories about people who couldn't write for themselves, who couldn't speak English as well as I could. I would try to tell their stories in a way that non-Spanish speakers, non-Spanish readers would understand, so that we see that we're just, part of humanity. And that is something that I always keep with me, and that really informs the way I write.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation, and thank you for letting me be a part of it and for sharing your amazing work. I think we're out of time. So if there's
Thank you, Adriana. I appreciate you very much.
Just brilliant. Thank you, Marisel and Adriana, for sharing your insights, experience, and passion to create such a wonderful conversation. I encourage you all to read this book. Thank you for joining us. Be well, stay safe, and stay connected.